So we've got the latest Battlefield, right? It's a brand new, graphically intense game that's built to push even the beefiest gaming rigs to their limits. But we're not going to do that. We're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to see if we can run this monster of a game on an extreme budget.
And that brings us to this absolutely wild question. Can you actually play this game with a graphics card that costs less than the game itself? I mean, it sounds kind of ridiculous on paper, but you might be surprised by the answer. So let's just lay it all out. On one side, you've got the game, which is going to set you back a cool $70. And on the other side, our little champion, a used AMD RX 570 graphics card, which you can easily find for less than $70. This is the ultimate David versus Goliath showdown in the world of PC gaming. Okay, let's take a quick look at the test rig. Now, the star of the show, obviously, is this AMD RX 570. It's the 4GB model from all the way back in 2017. To make sure that this GPU is the only thing holding us back, we've paired it with a really solid modern CPU and a ton of RAM. The bottleneck here is completely intentional. So, what are we trying to achieve here? What's the goal? It's that magic number in PC gaming, 60 frames per second. That is the gold standard for gameplay that feels smooth, responsive, and just good. Hitting that target on our super cheap card is the entire mission. All right, for our first attempt, we're just going to go with the brute force method. We're talking about aggressive upscaling. The whole idea is just to crank the performance settings as high as they'll go and see if we can force our way to that 60 FPS mark. To do this, we're using a feature called FSR, which stands for Fidelity FX Super Resolution, and we've got it set to Ultra Performance Mode. Now, what this actually does is pretty crazy. It renders the game at a super low resolution. We're talking like 360p. And then uses an algorithm to intelligently stretch and sharpen that tiny image up to fill a 1080p screen. So what was the result? Well, you know what? It kind of worked. The frame rate did get up to that 60 FPS target, but, and this is a huge but, the visual cost was massive. The image just looked really soft, kind of blurry, and you could easily spot these weird digital artifacts all over the place. Sure, it's playable, but it is not pretty. Okay, so the brute force method was a bust. Let's try something a little more modern. Something that almost sounds like magic. Frame generation. This technology literally promises to create new frames out of thin air, basically doubling your performance. So how in the world does this magic trick actually work? Well, it's a pretty brilliant three-step process. First, your graphics card renders one frame, just like it always does. Then some clever AI kicks in. It analyzes that frame and the one right before it to figure out the motion, and then it generates a brand new in-between frame. The result? A huge, almost unbelievable jump on the FPS counter. And would you just look at that number? We're seeing over 100 frames per second. I mean, on paper, this is a home run. We didn't just meet our goal of 60 FPS, we absolutely blew it out of the water. This has to be the perfect solution, right? Well, not quite. See, a high number on a performance counter doesn't always tell the whole story. As the person testing this pointed out, it just feels weird. You know that motion smoothing option on some TVs that makes movies look kind of fake and plasticky? It feels a lot like that. The gameplay just feels off, a bit unnatural. And this is what you could call the frame generation trap. When your real underlying frame rate is low to begin with, slapping these artificial frames on top can feel really jarring. You're still feeling the input lag and the choppiness of the original low frame rate, so the whole thing feels way less smooth than that big number would have you believe. So if the fancy high-tech solutions have these major drawbacks, where does that leave us? Well, we go back to basics. It turns out the winning method was a much simpler, almost old-school approach, just manually adjusting the game's internal resolution scale. And here it is, the winning combination of settings. You'll notice we turned all that fancy tech, both FSR and frame generation, completely off. Instead, we're just dropping the internal resolution scale down to 60%. Turning off the TAA anti-aliasing also helps a bit to keep the picture from getting too muddy. This just goes to show you what a fine line we're walking here. Apparently, dropping that resolution scale just another 10%, down to 50, turned the game into a really blurry mess. But kicking it back up to 60%, that was the sweet spot. That was the compromise that was visually acceptable while still giving us the performance we desperately needed. And the result of all this old-school tweaking? A clear win. The game now runs consistently at or above 60 frames per second. But more importantly, because every single one of these frames is real and not AI-generated, the whole experience is stable, consistent, and it just feels so much better to play. So it turns out the old school way was the best way. But let's step back for a second and look at the big picture. What's the final verdict on our little budget card that could?
This data here really tells the story of just how hard that little card had to work to make this happen. I mean, look at this. The GPU utilization was totally maxed out at 100%. Its video memory was completely full, and it was running pretty hot, up to 75 degrees Celsius. It was giving absolutely everything it had, and it was just barely pulling it off.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, the answer to our original question is yes. You absolutely can play a brand new $70 game on a graphics card that costs less than that. But, and believe me, this is a huge but, you have to be willing to accept some pretty major visual sacrifices to get that smooth 60 FPS gameplay.
And that really leaves us with one final big question for you to think about. For a gamer on a really tight budget, is having a blurrier, less detailed image a fair trade for getting to play the latest and greatest games? The technology makes it possible for sure, but whether or not it's actually worth it, well, that's a decision you've got to make for yourself.